In the autumn of 1989, a woman in New Mexico woke up unable to lift her arms over her head. The pain had started a few weeks before that. Deep in the muscle, both arms, both legs. Not soreness. Pain. Then her skin began to change. It thickened and tightened and hardened, until the doctors examining her forearms reached for a word they normally use for a tree. She had done one thing differently that year. She had bought a supplement off a shelf in a health food store, legal, sold in every state, made of something already in her food, and she had been taking it the way people take vitamins. She was not the only one. And more than 35 years later, nobody has ever identified what was in that bottle. Her name was Kathy Lorio. She was 44 years old and she lived in Los Alamos, New Mexico. In October of 1989, she went to see a local internist named Phil Hertzman. She had been healthy. She had been active. Now she was in pain that did not fit anything and she was getting worse. Hertzman did what any physician does with a patient who does not fit. He ordered blood work. And the count that came back was the reason this case exists. There is a white blood cell called an eosinophil. In a healthy person, there are a few hundred of them in every cubic millimeter of blood, and most of the time they have very little to do. In Kathy Lorio's blood there were more than 10,000. That is not a number you argue with. That is a number that means something specific is happening, and there is a short list of things that can do it. Hertzman started working the list. An eosinophil count that high has three classic explanations. The first is a parasite. Eosinophils are the part of the immune system built for things too large to swallow. Worms, flukes, the intruders a single cell cannot engulf. If they are multiplying, something is usually in there. The second is a drug reaction. The third is a blood cancer. Hertzman looked for all three. He did not find them. So he sent her to a specialist, a rheumatologist in Santa Fe named James Mayer, who saw the kind of patient nobody else could explain. And Mayer, listening to the history, recognized it. Because he had recently seen another woman with the same thing. Same crushing muscle pain. Same impossible eosinophil count. Same hardening skin. Her name was Bonnie Bishop. The two women had never met. They lived in different towns. They did not share a workplace, a water supply, a church, or a doctor. When the two histories were laid side by side, there was exactly one thing in both of them. Both women had been taking L-tryptophan. L-tryptophan is not an exotic compound. It is an amino acid, one of the building blocks of protein, and it is in turkey, in milk, in eggs, in almost everything you eat that contains protein. Your body cannot make it, so you get it from food. It is also the raw material your body uses to build serotonin. Which is why, by the late 1980s, it was being sold in bottles over the counter to Americans who wanted help sleeping or wanted to feel better. It was not classified as a drug. It was a supplement. It sat on the shelf next to vitamin C. Two patients on the same supplement is not a finding. In medicine, two of anything is a coincidence, and physicians are trained to say so. Hertzman went to the literature on eosinophils anyway, and one name kept appearing on the important papers. Gerald Gleich at the Mayo Clinic, who had spent his career on what these cells do and how they do it. Hertzman picked up the phone and called a man he had never met. Gleich told him what any careful scientist would tell him. 2 cases is not enough. That same day, a third case surfaced in New Mexico. Same picture. Same supplement. Gleich called the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. On the 30th of October, 1989, the New Mexico Health and Environment Department formally learned it had 3 patients with severe muscle pain, enormous eosinophil counts, and one product in common. Within 2 weeks, 3 more patients checked into the Mayo Clinic, from different parts of the country, none connected to New Mexico, all of them taking L-tryptophan. And then the third thing happened, and it is the reason the number stopped being 3. A reporter at the Albuquerque Journal named Tamar Stieber heard that 3 New Mexico doctors thought a supplement was making their patients sick. She had been at the paper about a year. She wrote it up and the paper ran it. Once it was printed, people who had been in pain for months, people who had been told, in some cases repeatedly, that there was nothing wrong with them, read it and recognized themselves. Within a short period, more than 300 cases were identified, across 38 states and the District of Columbia. Stieber won the Pulitzer Prize for specialized reporting in 1990 for it. The disease had been out there the whole time. What was missing was not a test. It was a name and a page to print it on. The disease got a name: eosinophilia-myalgia syndrome. The CDC wrote a surveillance definition so states could count it. And then the count began, and it did not stop. But here is what makes this a case and not just an outbreak. The tryptophan was not the problem. People had been taking it for years, the same molecule, the same dose, the same shelf, and nothing had happened. Something had changed. And it had not changed in the chemistry. It had changed in a building. This is the part that made the case a landmark in how you investigate a poison product. The investigators could not analyze their way to the answer. The compound in the bottle was, chemically, the same amino acid that had always been in the bottle. So they did the other thing. They stopped asking what and started asking whose. Patients still had their bottles. Bottles have lot numbers. Lot numbers go back to distributors, and distributors go back to manufacturers. Investigators in several states walked that chain backwards, patient by patient. At the time, essentially all of the world's L-tryptophan came from 6 companies. The cases converged on one: a Japanese chemical manufacturer called Showa Denko KK. Then Edward Belangia and colleagues, working the Minnesota outbreak, published a case control study in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1990 that went one level deeper. It did not just implicate the company. It implicated specific production conditions inside it. 2 manufacturing variables tracked with the disease. The first, the company produced tryptophan by bacterial fermentation, and in December of 1988 it had introduced a new, genetically engineered strain of the bacterium Bacillus amyloliquefaciens, the one the investigators labeled strain V. The second, in the purification step, the amount of powdered activated carbon used to filter each batch had been cut roughly in half, down to 10 kilograms. Filtration is where impurities are removed. Use less filter, and more of whatever else the vat produced goes into the bottle. Both changes were associated with disease, in the same batches at the same time. Which of them actually made the poison? That question is still open today. To understand what the contaminated batches did to these people, you have to understand what an eosinophil actually is, because it is not a normal immune cell. Most of your white cells work by swallowing. They find something foreign, they engulf it, they digest it internally. Clean, contained. An eosinophil is built for targets that are too big to swallow. It cannot engulf a parasitic worm. So it does the only thing left. It docks against the surface of the target, and it empties its contents outward, releasing granules packed with proteins that are chemically caustic. Major basic protein. Eosinophil-derived neurotoxin. Names that describe exactly what they do. It is not a scalpel. It is a demolition charge, and it goes off outside the cell. In a parasitic infection, that is the correct tool. In a person with no parasite, it is a chemical burn happening in slow motion in their own tissue. And here is the finding that tells you it happened, and it is the strangest detail in this case. When pathologists biopsied these patients, the hardened forearms, the painful muscle, they went looking for eosinophils in the tissue and found almost none. Intact eosinophils were sparse. What they found was the ammunition. Stained for major basic protein, the tissue lit up. Through the fascia. Around the blood vessels. Around the nerves. The cells had arrived, discharged everything they were carrying, and disappeared. What was left behind was not the shooters. It was what they fired. Now where it landed. Fascia is the sheet of connective tissue that wraps every muscle in your body. Think of a layer of cling film sleeved tightly around each one, letting it slide against its neighbors. In these patients, that sheet became dense and fibrous. It stopped sliding. The dermis above it filled with collagen and thickened. That is why the clinical description of the arms of these patients is woody in duration. The word is not a metaphor. The tissue acquired the density of wood. The same granule proteins were found around the nerves, and the nerves died the way damaged nerves die, from the far end backwards, longest first, so the feet go before the hands. In some patients, the process reached the lungs, which filled with the hazy pattern radiologists call ground glass. In some, it reached the muscles of breathing. And the poison itself? More than 60 minor impurities were eventually identified in the implicated product. 6 of them were statistically associated with the disease. 3 have known chemical structures, including one built from 2 tryptophan molecules joined together, and another called 3-phenylaminoalanine. 3 have never been identified at all. That is where it stands. The epidemiology is settled. One manufacturer, specific batches, specific production conditions. The chemistry is not. Animal studies have muddied it further. Rodents given tryptophan have developed similar changes even without the main suspect compound present. We can tell you where the poison came from. Nobody can tell you what it was. On the 17th of November, 1989, about 2 weeks after 3 patients in New Mexico were connected to each other, the Food and Drug Administration called for a nationwide recall of L-tryptophan. In March of 1990 it issued an import alert, and the product effectively left the American market. The epidemic stopped. That is the cleanest evidence in the entire case. Remove one product, and a disease that had been appearing in thousands of people across a continent simply stopped appearing. The final American count was more than 1,500 documented cases and at least 37 deaths, and both figures are understood to be low, because the surveillance definition required a specific eosinophil threshold and milder cases never met it. For the survivors, it did not end with the recall. This was not an illness people got over. Many were left with permanent nerve damage and permanently thickened skin, still disabled years later, in some cases for the rest of their lives. Cases linked to tryptophan continue to be reported for decades afterwards. Litigation against Showa Denko was eventually settled for a figure reported at around $2 billion. It left behind a disease that had not existed as a diagnosis before October of 1989. The CDC wrote a surveillance definition in the middle of the outbreak, and researchers replaced it in 2001 with a tighter one that is about 97% specific. Eosinophilia-myalgia syndrome is now a named entity in the medical literature, and a physician who sees it can recognize it. It also left behind a method, and the method is the reason this case gets taught. When the chemistry fails you, you find the supply chain. The chemists never identified the molecule, they still have not. The epidemiologists identified the company, the bacterial strain and the filtration change, working from lot numbers printed on bottles sitting in patients' kitchens. That is now one of the reference approaches for finding a poison inside a consumer product. The product itself came back. The FDA loosened its restrictions on tryptophan in 2001 and lifted them entirely in 2005. It is on shelves today from other manufacturers, under different production conditions. And then there is the part this channel exists to say out loud. The largest epidemic ever caused by a dietary supplement in the United States happened in 1989 and 1990. 5 years later, in October of 1994, Congress passed the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. Under that law, dietary supplements are regulated as food, not as drugs. There is no pre-market approval. A manufacturer does not have to prove to the FDA that a supplement is safe and effective before selling it, the way a drug company must. If there is a problem, the burden falls the other way. The agency has to establish that the product presents a risk after it is already on the shelf. That is the legal framework the United States operates under right now. It is documented legislative history and you can read the statute. The burden of proof moved in the opposite direction from the one this case would suggest. One more loose threat because it is a real one. That contaminant with the known structure, 3-phenylaminoalanine, is a close chemical relative of a compound implicated in a different epidemic, the toxic oil syndrome that struck Spain in 1981 from adulterated cooking oil, which sickened tens of thousands of people. 2 consumer products, 2 countries, a decade apart, 2 poisons that were never conclusively pinned down, and a family resemblance between them that has never been fully explained. Phil Hertzman had 2 patients. 2 is a coincidence. He had been trained to know that, and he was right to know it. Every physician who has ever been wrong about a pattern was looking at 2 of something. He called a specialist he had never met anyway on the strength of 2. If he had waited for a third, for the number that would have made him feel professionally safe, the recall comes weeks later, and weeks at that scale is measured in people. So here is the question. In your own work, with your own reputation on the line, at what point does a coincidence become worth the phone call?